Hey, sleepyheads! Another night, another door to open. Before we begin, drop your answer in the comments. Which country are you watching from, and who is your favorite person from its history? Now close your eyes, take a slow breath, and imagine standing in a vast arena. 50,000 voices scream, not in fear but in excitement. You are not a hero. You are a slave, a prisoner, a number. And in just a few minutes, your blood will decide if they cheer or turn away. This isn't a game. This is ancient Rome. And you are in the Colosseum. Welcome to the Roman Empire, where bread and circuses kept the masses fed and distracted. And no circus was more powerful than the Gladiator games. Built in 80 AD, the Colosseum was more than stone. It was a machine of control, a place where men were promised freedom only to be consumed by the system. They called them gladiators, but most were not warriors by choice. They were slaves, criminals, enemies of the state. And once you entered the arena, the only way out was death or the illusion of mercy. They trained in Ludi special gladiator schools, fed just enough, taught how to fight, not to survive, but to entertain. Sometimes the emperor would promise freedom. If you fight well, you may be released. But this was a game of numbers, of spectacle. You were more valuable dead in the sand than alive and forgotten. And yet, they clung to hope. Because hope is the most dangerous weapon of all. The Colosseum was an architectural marvel and a machine of murder. Trapdoors, elevators, cages beneath the ground. Lions, tigers, bears, even elephants would rise from the earth like demons. And you? You were just part of the show. The games were never fair. Sometimes gladiators fought blindfolded, sometimes armed with wooden swords against steel, and sometimes they weren't told their opponent was a wild beast until the gate opened. Every moment was designed to shock, thrill, and control the crowd. They watched with popcorn made of barley, laughing, betting, cheering. Children mimicked the moves. Senators placed bets. And emperors sat back and judged life with a single thumb. Life became a coin toss, a thumb up or down. And for the audience, the more brutal the death, the louder the applause. It wasn't about justice, it was about control. Here's the truth they never told you in history class. The gladiator games weren't just physical battles. They were psychological warfare. The promise of freedom, the cheers of the crowd, the silent eyes of the emperor. It was all manipulation. Every swing of the sword wasn't just for survival, it was for a fantasy they dangled just out of reach. You had to smile through pain, bow through blood, and hope even when you knew hope was a lie. Just like in Squid Game, you weren't playing to win. You were playing to not die first. What is Squid Game, if not a modern Colosseum? Desperate people, fighting in secret, for the entertainment of the elite. Gladiators fought for a chance at life. Squid Game players fight for a chance at money. Both are promised something they likely won't receive. And both are being watched by people who do nothing, say nothing, but control everything. The game hasn't changed. Only the arena has. Next, we travel across the ocean to a place where wars weren't fought for land, but for sacrifice, where gods watched from above and warriors bled below. Let's begin the second story of tonight. Long before skyscrapers, before steel and glass, there was a valley, lush, alive, breathing with gods and death. And in that valley stood warriors who bled not for money, but for the sun. They entered a battle, not to win, but to die beautifully. This is not war. This is the Aztec Flower War. Welcome to the Valley of Mexico. The year? 1450. A world ruled not by kings, but by cosmic cycles. To the Aztecs, time was a serpent swallowing its own tail. Everything, birth, death, harvest, love, loss, repeated endlessly. And only one thing kept this sacred wheel turning: blood. Not just any blood, the blood of warriors. You see, the Aztecs believed the sun was dying, every single day, and only sacrifice could restart the world. The flower wars weren't accidental. They were engineered. 3 city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, formed the Aztec Triple Alliance. Together they built a mighty empire, but they needed captives, not for slavery, not for land, but for sacrifice. So they made a pact with rival city-states, organized battles on open fields, predetermined, formal, ritualistic. It was agreed, no slaughter, just capture. And those captured would ascend the pyramid steps to meet the knife. These were not chaotic skirmishes. They were ritual performances. The fields were cleared, banners were raised, war drums thundered through the valleys. Each warrior painted in symbols of gods, eagles, jaguars, fire serpents. They were expected to fight with honor, not kill aimlessly, but display courage, agility, and skill. The macuahuitl, a wooden sword edged with obsidian glass, could decapitate a man with one swing. But the goal wasn't to kill. It was to disarm and capture. From the time a boy could walk, he trained for war. At age 15, he entered a telpochcali, a warrior school. He would carry logs, endure pain, sleep on the floor. No comfort, no softness. Only strength. Only obedience. Only readiness to die. But not just to win battles. To sacrifice himself for his people. To be chosen. And deep down, every Aztec boy had the same dream. To climb the temple steps as the sun rose and offer his heart to the gods. You might think this is madness, but to the Aztecs, there was no greater honor. To die in a flower war meant your soul would travel with the sun, reborn as a hummingbird, forever soaring across the skies. The battlefield was a gateway. And the priest with the obsidian knife, he wasn't your executioner. He was your guide. This wasn't murder. It was transcendence. The gods demanded blood, and the warriors were proud to give it. Let's pause for a moment. How different is this from Squid Game? Volunteers, knowing the odds, still stepping forward. Why? Because their system convinced them that death with honor is better than life in shame. Both the Aztec warrior and the Squid Game player are caught in a lie they've been taught to worship. The gods of Tenochtitlan wore feathers. The gods of Squid Game wear suits. But they all demand the same thing: blood, entertainment, control. But this is just the beginning. Because behind the honor was something darker. Manipulation, propaganda, and a system that fed on its own people. They were never called victims. They were offerings. When a warrior was captured on the battlefield, he wasn't dragged away in chains. He was walked with honor, escorted like a noble gift. The Aztecs would clothe him, feed him, sometimes even praise him. Not to show mercy, but to prepare him for what came next. He was no longer a man. He was a vessel, a soul on loan to the gods. At the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, the captives were brought to the top. 75 steps, one for each heartbeat they might have left. And when the obsidian blade struck, it wasn't considered violence. It was renewal, Their blood soaked the stone, and the sun, they believed, would rise again. The Templo Mayor towered over the city, not just in size, but in symbolism. Twin temples sat on top. One for Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and one for Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Blood ran down its steps during ceremonies, and the people watched from below, not in horror, but in celebration. Sacrifice wasn't hidden. It was center stage. And that visibility was the point. It reminded every citizen, this city thrives because someone bleeds. It turned death into a ritual. And ritual into obedience. The flower wars weren't spontaneous. They were designed. The Aztec elite knew that real war was costly, in soldiers, in cities, in control. So they created an alternative. Ritual war. It let the military train. It let enemies stay weak. And most of all, it let the state control the story. Posters of the time carved in stone, etched in codices, showed glorious captures, noble deaths. But they never showed fear, never showed doubt. Every sacrifice was propaganda. Every war a performance, and every citizen an audience to fear. The captives had roles. Some were dressed as gods in the final days. The Ixiptla, the living image of a deity, would wear golden masks, jewels and feathers. He would be treated as divine, worshipped, prayed to, even fed delicacies. But he knew his fate. The moment the music stopped, he would walk to the altar. To the people, this was holy. To the system, it was a powerful trick. It blurred the line between execution and exaltation. As the empire grew, so did the need for sacrifice. But not everyone agreed. Some city-states resisted. Others saw through the illusion. They realized these ritual wars weren't just about religion, they were about control. The Aztec rulers feared unrest, so they tightened their grip. More ceremonies, more blood, more festivals, all to remind the people, without the gods you have nothing. And without us, the gods are not fed. It wasn't about the sun. It was about submission. The flower wars were never meant to end. They were a perfect system, self-sustaining, self-justifying, and soaked in obedience. But what happens when people stop believing? When a captive sees through the mask? When sacrifice turns to rebellion? What if you were chosen, not to lead, not to rule, but to die? What if they painted your face, fed you wine, gave you gold, but behind every smile was a knife? One warrior, one ritual, one decision that shattered the illusion of gods. This is the story of the man who refused to kneel. His name is lost to time, but the Aztec codices call him the bound one who spoke. He was captured in a flower war near the valley of Tlaxcala. Young, skilled, feared by his enemies. He fought to be remembered, and they did remember him not as a warrior, but as a sacrifice. They brought him to Tenochtitlan in chains, but not for prison, for honor. He would be dressed in feathers. He would be called the Ixiptla, a living god. And on the day of the sun, he would climb the temple and offer his heart. In his final days, he saw what others missed. He watched priests laughing. He overheard soldiers speaking of quotas. He noticed that not everyone bowed with belief, some bowed with fear. In the market, a woman whispered to him, "They say the gods speak through blood, but I've never heard them say a word." The bound one began to see the flower wars, not as sacred, but as strategy. And the altar wasn't a stairway to the sun. It was a stage, and he was the show. On the morning of his sacrifice, he was robed in blue and gold. Drums echoed through the square. The people cheered. Priests raised their obsidian blades. He was led up the steps of the Templo Mayor, 75 stairs, each one carved with stories of warriors before him. But at the top, something changed. He did not kneel. Instead, he stood, faced the sky, and shouted words no one expected. "I am not your gift. I am not your God. I am not afraid." The crowd went silent. Even the priests froze. Then came the chaos. Some say he fought. Some say he ran. Some say he leapt from the pyramid, choosing death on his terms. Others believe he was cut down, not with a ceremonial blade, but with rage. But one thing is certain. That day, he broke the script. In the years that followed, stories of the bound one who spoke spread across the valley. He became a symbol of doubt, of rebellion, of the idea that maybe, just maybe, sacrifice is not sacred but man-made. And for the first time, people began to wonder, what if the gods don't need blood? What if the gods were created to keep us obedient? He was one man, but his defiance echoed through temples and markets alike. Now, we go deeper. To the ceremonies, to the priests, to the very core of the Aztec belief system, where fear was dressed in feathers and obedience carved in stone. They called it sacred. But what happens when a temple becomes a machine? When gods are no longer worshipped, but manufactured? Inside the heart of the Aztec Empire stood a system of sacrifice. Precise, powerful, and chillingly organized. This is no myth. This is the Temple of the Knife. The Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, wasn't just a building. It was an engine. Every carving, every incense bowl, every blood-stained step was part of a machine designed to keep the empire turning. Sacrifice was scheduled. Ceremonies were rehearsed. Roles were assigned from the high priest to the feather bearer to the blade holder. This wasn't chaos. This was ritualized governance. Like an ancient factory, processing human belief into power. When the day arrived, the streets filled before dawn. Priests fasted. Participants were painted with ash and ochre. Drummers began slow, heartbeat-like thuds that echoed through the stone alleys. At sunrise, the captive was brought forth, not dragged, not beaten, but dressed in jewels, made divine in appearance, and then with hundreds watching, he was laid across the stone. 4 priests held his limbs. One held the blade. The cut was swift. The heart was raised. The blood spilled down the steps. And the people cheered. Because in their minds, they weren't witnessing death. They were saving the world. The Aztec priests were not soft-spoken monks. They were executors of cosmic balance, chosen in youth. Trained to endure pain, fasting, solitude, shaved heads, black robes, eyes lined with ritual ink. They did not question. They performed. But some historians now believe many did question silently. Hidden writings, destroyed codices, buried symbols suggest there were whispers that the priests themselves sometimes wondered if they were feeding the gods or simply feeding the empire. Make no mistake, this was performance. Each element choreographed, the flute sound that signals the descent of the spirit, the chanting that mimics rainfall, the timing of blood spill aligned with solar positioning. The Aztec leadership knew that belief must be seen to stay alive. And so the rituals were grand, overwhelming, unforgettable. It wasn't just for the gods. It was for the crowd. Spectacle bred obedience. And obedience fed the system. Now, imagine growing up in this world. Every sunrise meant someone had bled. Every harvest meant someone had died. You never questioned it. Because it worked. Until one day, someone didn't bow. Someone said no. and the system cracked, just a little. But enough for some to see behind the curtain. Enough to ask the question, if the gods truly need sacrifice, why are only the poor and the captured dying? Some would call it faith, others would call it fear in disguise. Now imagine a wall, but not of stone, not of brick. A wall made of skulls, eyes hollow, jaws cracked, dozens, hundreds, thousands. This is not decoration. This is a message. Welcome to the Chamber of Skulls. Just outside the Templo Mayor stood the Tzompantli, a massive rack of human skulls, cleaned, polished, stacked on wooden poles like beads on a string. Not hidden, not sacred, public, proud, blunt. This was not just a monument. It was a warning, a billboard of power saying, this is what happens to those who disobey, and this is what happens to those who are chosen. Fear was a currency. The flower wars didn't just collect bodies. They collected obedience. A child walking past the skull rack knew the truth before he could even read, the gods are watching. The priests are watching. And if you fail in war, in honor, in belief, your skull joins the wall. This was trauma passed on like scripture. Not through words, but through silence and bone. Even the sound of a skull cracking was sacred. To remind everyone, death is not random, it is law. The skulls weren't labeled. No names, no history, no stories. Just empty sockets. You could have been a brave warrior, a rebel, a prophet, a traitor. Once your head was mounted, you became the same as the rest. This was the second death. Not of the body, but of identity. And it was done on purpose, because identity fuels rebellion. Memory sparks resistance. The Tzompantli erased both. Sometimes the skulls were painted, other times filled with cotton and straw to resemble faces. During great festivals, torches were lit beneath them, casting long shadows, making them look alive. Children were brought here. New warriors were brought here. Even foreign dignitaries were brought here. Why? To teach them that obedience was survival, and the empire was forever. The Chamber of Skulls was more than a warning. It was the heartbeat of the empire's lie. It said, your blood is needed. Your life has one purpose. And if you die well, your bones will speak for you. But what it really meant was that control lasts longer than faith, and fear is easier to manage than truth. Now, the wall begins to crack because no system of death lasts forever. Up next, we follow the crumbling of the empire, the arrival of the Spanish, and the final sacrifices made as a civilization gasped its last breath. It began with fire. It ends with silence. The flower wars, rituals dressed in honor, soaked in blood, kept an empire alive for centuries. But even gods can bleed. Even empires fall. This is the final heartbeat. 1519. From across the ocean they came. Men with iron skin and thunder in their hands. The Spanish, led by Hernán Cortés. They had never seen pyramids before, or heard drums that summoned gods, or walked beneath walls made of skulls. But they saw something familiar. Power, fear, a system designed to control, and they made a decision. Break the cycle. Not to save the people, but to replace the gods. As the Spanish marched inland, they met enemies of the Aztecs, Tlaxcalans, Totonacs, who remembered the flower wars not as honor, but as horror. The ritualized battles had weakened the Aztec enemies, but they had also united them in resentment. The empire's greatest strength, its spectacle, had become its greatest weakness. Because when death is predictable, resistance becomes organized. And now resistance wore armor. As Tenochtitlan fell, priests rushed to the temples. They believed the gods were angry. They believed more blood might save the city. Captives were dragged up the steps. Hearts were cut. Drums beat faster. Faster, faster. Until they stopped, because eventually there were no more captives. No more warriors. No more gods. Only silence. Only smoke. Only the sound of an empire exhaling for the last time. The pyramids were burned. The idols were shattered. The Tzompantli collapsed into dust. But the memory, the machine, the idea, it never really died. Because across time and continents, new systems were built. New gods created. New rules written. And once again people were told, obey, bow, sacrifice. Accept your fate. Squid Game. Reality TV. Warfare. Debt. Politics. The forms change. But the flower wars continue. The names are different. But the message stays the same. Die beautifully. And maybe you'll be remembered. It's no longer about gods. It's about power. And the illusion. That surrender is sacred. But you, dear, sleep well, because this is just past, waiting to be remembered. There are stories that don't sleep when the world does. There are games that aren't meant to be played. And sometimes, silence is louder than screams. It was winter. The kind that made men cough blood before breakfast. The kind that snapped horses in half if they stood too long. Inside a creaking wooden barracks, half buried in snow, sat 6 soldiers. Their coats were stiff with ice, their eyes sunken, their hands trembling not from fear, but from the cold, and maybe something deeper. His name was Alexei. He didn't speak much, but when he did, the others listened. Tonight he had something to say. Have you heard about the officers at the Western Post? The men turned their heads. They play a game, he said slowly, with a revolver. 1 bullet, spin the cylinder, pull the trigger. They say, the one who survives gets a bottle of French brandy. Silence. No one laughed. No one scoffed. Because this wasn't the kind of war where jokes survived. Why would they do that? One finally asked. Alexei looked at his frozen knuckles. Because some men would rather face death once, cleanly, than wait for it every minute of every day. The game, as it was whispered, had no name. But it began making rounds. Through trenches, through camps, through men who had nothing left but each other, and the emptiness inside. And slowly, like frostbite in the toes, it spread. Let me tell you what they say happened next. The first to play it was a man named Ivan. They say he had survived 3 mortar shells and had nothing left to lose. But on that night, under the flickering oil lamp, he lost a 4th thing, his silence. He pulled the trigger. Click. He lived. And the others stared at him like he had swallowed a ghost. But he didn't smile. He just handed the revolver to the next man and said, "Now it's your turn." And this is how it began. The revolver sat in the middle of the wooden crate like an idol. Steel. Cold. Quiet. It was passed between fingers that once held pencils and violins and small clumsy babies. Now they only held frost. And fate. Alexei had watched Ivan survive that night. But survival is a strange thing in war. Sometimes it looks like winning. Sometimes it looks like you just borrowed time. Why are you still alive? A younger soldier had asked him the next morning. Ivan didn't answer. He just lit a cigarette with shaking fingers and smiled at the snow. In the weeks that followed, the game grew. It wasn't spoken of in the open, only in the quiet hours between shellfire and letters from home. They played in cellars. They played in train cars. They played inside burnt chapels, crosses shattered behind them as if death were the only god left. Sometimes the bullet fired, and sometimes it didn't. Each man swore they saw something different in the eyes of the one who lived. Regret. Relief. Emptiness. One day a man named Dmitri brought the revolver into the mess tent. 5 of us, he said. 1 bullet, 1 answer. Who's going to ride home tonight? No one laughed. No one stopped him. And that's when the game stopped being a game. A man once wrote in his journal, "The roulette is not about bravery, it's about control. It is the only time I hold my fate entirely in my own hand, and I've never felt more alive than when I almost died." That man disappeared 3 days later. No body. No goodbye. Just gone. Some say he took the revolver with him. Others say he left it behind waiting for the next hand, the next breath, the next whisper. Now, let me tell you about Captain Malenkov, the man who tried to stop the game. Captain Malenkov was young for a leader. He had eyes that had seen too much and shoulders that carried more than orders. When he heard of the game, he ordered the revolver destroyed. "This is not honor," he told his men. "This is suicide, dressed as bravery." But the revolver was not just metal anymore. It was a myth, and you can't kill a myth with a speech. 2 days later, Captain Malenkov vanished too. Some say he walked into the forest alone, holding a bullet in his fist. Others say the men turned on him. But either way after that, the game had no rules. And no one to stop it. So now, let's go deeper. Into the bunkers. Into the trenches. Into the places where the barrel met the temple. And history forgot their names. Because the game didn't end. And still, somewhere in the ice, the revolver spins. "We don't play to win," Alexei once whispered. "We play so we don't forget we're alive." They were stationed at Fort Vostok, a remote outpost near the edge of nowhere. The kind of place where days bled into nights and nights stretched into weeks. By the time winter blanketed the barracks with silence, only 4 men remained. The rest had been sent west, or buried east. Inside the wooden cellar of that snow-crushed outpost sat Sergei, Mikhail, Lev, and Alexei. They had no orders, no food, no maps that still mattered. Just one small fire, and the revolver. Wrapped in oiled cloth, hidden inside a tea tin. Always waiting. That night, Sergei looked at the others and said, "Let's play for the names." Mikhail frowned. "What names?" "The ones we lost, the ones we forgot." So they played. But instead of silence after the click, they spoke a name. Each turn, a memory. Luka, the boy with the cracked violin. Sasha, the one who danced like a fool even with frostbite. Nikita, who never fired his rifle but wrote poems in the dirt. Each time the trigger clicked, a name returned from the dead. But then the trigger didn't click. It fired, and Lev slumped forward, eyes open as if still listening. The others froze, but no one cried. They just whispered one final name. Lev. They wrapped him in canvas, buried him beneath the snow, placed the revolver on top of his grave, and walked back inside. "He wanted to be remembered," Mikhail said softly. "Now he is." The revolver remained outside, buried beneath frost and ice, but sometimes in the middle of the night, they swore they could hear it spinning, not in metal, but in their minds. And that's when the game changed again. Alexei began to speak in riddles. "Maybe we're all already dead," he murmured one morning, staring into the fire. "And this is just the waiting room. The game helps us remember how it felt, to risk." By now the war was shifting, but no one had come for them. No messages, no orders. Just snow and silence. "So what do we do now?" "We remember," Alexei said. "We play." There, beneath the snow, the barrel spun. Not to end lives, but to keep memories alive. "Peace," they said. "It's over," they whispered. But no one told the mind how to stop fighting. The war ended on a Sunday. Or at least that's what they told Alexei, now back in a crumbling apartment in St. Petersburg, the same city where his mother once baked honey bread and filled his pockets with chalk candies. But nothing felt real anymore. Not the silence. Not the pigeons fluttering in the square. Not even the children's laughter, which sounded more like distant gunfire if you listened the wrong way. The revolver had come home with him. He didn't remember packing it. Didn't remember choosing to keep it. But there it was, wrapped in the same oiled cloth, tucked inside his rucksack like a relic. A ghost. That night he sat alone at the edge of his bed, hands shaking. Teacup untouched. Window open, letting in the winter air. And he thought about playing again. Not for survival this time. Not even for memory, but for understanding. Why am I still here? He loaded the chamber, spun it, held it to his temple. Click. He breathed out slowly and began to cry. Across the city, similar stories began to unfold. Veterans with haunted eyes. Men who jumped at door slams. Fathers who couldn't hold their children without shaking. One of them, Dmitri, wrote in his journal, "I survived the war, but I brought it with me. And some nights when the silence is too loud, I still spin the chamber. Not to die, just to hear it whisper back." The newspapers printed headlines like, "Survivor's Syndrome Strikes Thousands." Shell shock cases rising among veterans. But no one knew what to call it. The doctors offered pills. The priests offered prayers. But the men only wanted silence that didn't feel like drowning. Alexei began attending a support group, unofficial, held in the back of an abandoned schoolroom. There were 6 of them. None had spoken much at first. But over time, one question began to appear in their circle like a ghost. "Do you still have yours?" The revolvers. They all had them. And one night, without planning it, they placed one in the center of the circle. Loaded, spun, passed. But this time, no one pulled the trigger. They just watched it spin. And in the quiet hum of its movement, they began to talk. About the screams, about the snow, about the friends they buried without names. "I don't want to die," one of them said. "I just want to know I could have," and didn't. They began calling it the ghost chamber. A way to speak without speaking. To remember without pain. To sit with the game, not to die, but to heal. And so the revolver became a ritual again. But different. No more blood, no more wages, only presence. They played the game to stay human. To sit at the edge of death and choose to live. The ghost was not in the bullet. It was in them. There was a man once, small, bent at the shoulders, with hands that shook only when he wasn't working. His name was Anton Petrov. They called him the watchmaker. He hadn't been to war. Not on the front lines. But he heard it, every hour, in the broken watches that came into his repair shop. Pieces of time shattered by bombs and blood and loss. He had a gift. He could take apart anything that ticked and make it tick again. Except maybe himself. Anton first heard about the game in whispers. A soldier came in one day pale, hollow-eyed, and placed a broken pocket watch on the counter. "Can you fix this?" Anton nodded. But the soldier didn't leave. Instead, he took something else from his coat pocket and placed it beside the watch. A revolver. Old, heavy, cold. "It spins," the soldier said, "but the bullet never lands. Do you believe in fate, watchmaker?" Anton didn't answer. He only stared. And the next day, when the soldier never returned, he kept the revolver. That night, Anton didn't sleep. He placed the gun on his workbench, unloaded it, measured it, weighed every part. And then, he began to modify it. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to kill. He wanted to understand. If fate was real, could it be predicted? Engineered? Could a man control what should be random? He installed a micro-weight in the chamber. Subtle, undetectable to the eye. A click here. A shift there. With time, he could tell where the bullet would fall. Not guess. No. He called it the clock gun. To anyone else, it was a standard revolver. But to Anton, it was a machine of probability. A mechanism of false chaos. And when he finally loaded it, spun it, and held it to his head, he wasn't gambling. He was testing himself. Could he beat fate? Click. He lived. Of course he lived. He had built the odds. But something changed after that. The feeling didn't go away. He stopped fixing watches, stopped talking to his neighbors, sat in his shop, spinning the chamber, staring at it for hours. Not playing. Just watching. Measuring. Obsessing. He began inviting others in. Not to sell. Not to help. But to observe. Veterans. Broken men. Wanderers with scars that didn't bleed anymore. He showed them the revolver. Taught them how to spin it. How to count the clicks. How to know. There is no fate, he said, only pattern. But one night a boy no older than 20 came in. He didn't want lessons. He didn't want numbers. He just wanted to stop feeling anything. Anton handed him the gun. Told him where to place the bullet. It will not fire, trust me. The boy smiled faintly. Spun the cylinder. Lifted the barrel. And pulled. Anton hadn't accounted for the weight of the boy's hand. The angle of the room. The oil in the chamber. He had been wrong. The game wasn't just pattern. It wasn't just logic. It wasn't just probability. It was something older. Something cruel. Something that didn't care what you believed. Anton closed his shop that night. They found him weeks later, in a chair, staring at the revolver. Not dead. Not insane. Just gone in every other way. The gun was passed on again. And again. And again. But no one could make it predictable. Not truly. Because the truth was simple. Russian roulette was not a test. It was a mirror. And sometimes the reflection pulled the trigger first. The revolver sits alone. On a table. Under a single light. There is dust on the barrel now. But still, it waits. They say the last known game was played by a man named Yuri. He wasn't a soldier, not a gambler, not broken, not even desperate. He was curious. He had read everything. The war memoirs. The psychiatric journals. The scribbled notes left behind by men who had played. But to Yuri, the gun was never a weapon. It was a question. What happens when you place your life in the hands of chance and survive? He wasn't looking to die. He was looking to see what changes inside a person who comes that close and stays. So he prepared. For months. He didn't eat recklessly, didn't drink, didn't cry, just studied. And one day, in a quiet stone cottage deep in the countryside, he set the revolver on the table. He lit a candle, poured a cup of tea, and placed a single bullet inside. But before he pulled the trigger, he wrote a letter. If I live, I will write the truth. If I die, then perhaps the truth was never meant to be written. He pulled. Click. He set the revolver down. But Yuri did not rejoice. He didn't cheer. Didn't run to write a book. He just sat there, for hours, still, listening to something only he could hear. The next morning, he packed the revolver in a wooden box, wrapped it in linen, and buried it beneath a willow tree behind the cottage. He never spoke of it again. Some say the revolver still lies there, rusting, forgotten. Others say Yuri dug it up years later in the dead of night and cast it into the sea. No one knows, because the story was never about the gun. Not really. It was about what we do when we confront the unknown, when we hold fate in our hands and realize it never belonged to us. The revolver, the chamber, the spin, it's inside us now. Some spin dice in relationships, some in business, some in the quiet war inside their heads every single day. The rules are different now, but the silence before the click, it's still the same. There are games that take your life, and there are games that show you what it was worth. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, if you hear a faint click, a whisper from the dark, don't be afraid. It's just the past, spinning once more, waiting to be remembered. Let's begin our next story from the past. Not gore, not shock. This is a quiet walk through a place that shouldn't have existed, whispered like a ghost story, focused on memory, haunting silence, and the psychology of false hope. Like Squid Game, this is a story of systems pretending to be salvation, when they're actually a slow execution. Some prisons do not have bars. Some games are not played for prizes. And sometimes, silence can be a weapon. It was cold. Not the kind of cold you measure, but the kind that creeps behind your eyes, the kind that turns your breath into ghosts. The place had no name, not officially, just coordinates, deep in the Pingfang district of occupied Manchuria. The locals called it the Devil's Laboratory, but the men inside had a different name for it. Unit 731. At first glance, it looked like a research facility. White coats, clipboards, fences, even a sign that read, "For Advancement of Human Health." But inside, there were no patients, only subjects. Yuki was 19 when he was brought in. A farmer, son of a carpenter. He had been taken from his village with his younger brother. "You'll be helping the Empire," they told him. "If you do well, you will go free." They gave him clean clothes, a bowl of warm rice, a cot, and a form to sign. It looked official, even had a seal. He couldn't read it. He signed anyway. That night the wind howled outside, and a man in the bunk beside him whispered, "This is not a hospital. This is a cage." But it was not the bars that mattered here. It was the hope. The whispers that said, "If you survive this, they'll let you go. Just cooperate, don't resist. You'll be home before winter." They called it the program. Each week a small group was chosen. Always volunteers. Always promised something. Bread, letters home, even freedom. The first game was simple. A race. 6 men, outside, in the snow. But before the race, each had been cut in a different way. Not to kill them, but to see who could run the farthest, before falling. Yuki watched from the window. One man bled from his thigh, another from his foot. One had no toes left. The race began, but no one cheered. Only pens scratched on paper. And a doctor, expressionless, held a stopwatch. That night, Yuki didn't sleep. He asked the man in the next bed, "Why did they run?" The man answered, "Because they told them the one who finishes gets to go home." Did anyone finish? No. Outside, the wind carried laughter. Not loud, not manic, but quiet. Controlled, like people who knew they would never be punished. That was the first test. but not the last. Not by far. And so it begins. The first whispers behind the walls, the first lie coated in mercy, the beginning of a game no one agreed to play. There are rooms meant for healing. And then, there are rooms where the walls only watch, rooms where no reflection remains, because nothing human is meant to last there. They never called them people. They were given numbers. Yuki's number was test subject 347B. He tried not to forget his name. He whispered it into his hands every night. Yuki. My name is Yuki. Because once you forget your name, they win. Each day began the same. Metal trays. Watered soup. A voice through the speaker. Subject 347B. Report to testing chamber 4. No one ever came back the same. Some didn't come back at all. One day, Yuki was led to a room with no mirrors. Just bright white walls, an exam table, and 3 men in lab coats who never gave their names. One of them smiled gently. We're testing your blood's resistance to temperature extremes. If your numbers look good, we'll clear you. You'll go home. Yuki's heart almost leapt. Home? The man nodded. We've had survivors. They made him sit, strapped his wrists gently, and brought in ice water. So cold it steamed when poured. They didn't ask questions. They only took notes. Minutes passed, then an hour. Yuki's breath turned to glass, his fingers pale, his skin numb. He began to shiver uncontrollably. Still, no mirrors, no faces, only clipboards. And the man repeated softly, You're doing well, just a bit longer, freedom is near. When it was over, they wrapped his hands in gauze, led him back to his cot. No words, no answers, just a whisper from another subject. Did they tell you the thing about going home? Yuki nodded. The man chuckled, dry and hollow. They told me that too, 2 winters ago. That night, Yuki dreamt of mirrors. But in the dream, he had no face, just numbers on his forehead, and hands that bled ice. In the morning, another subject was missing. The others didn't ask. They only looked away, because by now, everyone knew. Hope was a syringe, and they were the needle. And the rooms with no mirrors. They weren't empty. They were full of things too human to see. Screams behind thick glass. Eyes that looked straight ahead but never truly opened. It was not death they feared most. It was not knowing when the lie would come for them next. So Yuki whispered again, My name is Yuki. My name is Yuki. Because the only freedom left was remembering who you were. They didn't call it punishment. They didn't call it execution. They called it data. It began with an announcement. A voice crackled through the speaker. Test subjects 341 through 347. Prepare for outdoor rotation. Yuki sat still. He was 347. He looked at his hands, still wrapped in gauze from the cold water immersion test, still numb. His breath formed small clouds that disappeared in the air. They were brought to a field just outside the facility, a square of packed snow, surrounded by clipboard men in white coats, and a row of soldiers, holding rifles that pointed at nothing but meant everything. The subjects stood barefoot, wearing only hospital gowns, thin, white, torn at the seams. One man asked, "What is this?" The answer came from behind a mask, a resistance assessment. "We are studying endurance." Another man added with polite calmness, "Those who last longest will be recommended for release." Release. The word hit harder than the wind. Yuki could almost see the faces of his parents. A dinner table. A river near the orchard. Could it be true? Could surviving this bring freedom? They were lined up, 6 of them, each spaced several feet apart, snow swirling around their legs. The test began with a bell. Simple, soft, like the start of a game at school. But no one moved, no one ran. They just stood. The first subject, an older man named Tetsuo, collapsed within 5 minutes. A soldier stepped forward, lifted him, carried him away in silence. No explanation, no word. The next fell 20 minutes later. Then another, until only 2 remained, Yuki and a boy named Kenji. They weren't racing. They weren't speaking. They were simply waiting to be chosen, not by mercy, but by the cold. Kenji's lips were blue now. His fingers curled inward, frozen. He looked at Yuki and whispered, "Do you think they're really watching?" Yuki didn't answer, because deep inside, he knew. This wasn't a test. It was a ritual. A performance for people who wanted to watch how humans break. Kenji fell. No scream, just a soft thud in the snow. Yuki stood alone, barefoot, bleeding. Still, a man with a pen stepped forward and muttered, "Remarkable subject." And to Yuki he said, "You'll return to holding. We'll report your outcome." No release, no reward, just more silence. Back in his cell, a nurse, faceless, silent, wrapped his feet. And Yuki realized something for the first time. The reward is surviving just enough to be tested again. He whispered to himself, not freedom, not escape, only delay. He curled beneath the blanket, not to sleep, but to hide. Because when the game has no winner, the only strategy is disappearing. He did not wear a mask. He did not yell. And yet, when he entered the room, the silence thickened like smoke. Yuki had begun to lose count of the days. Sometimes the light stayed on for hours. Sometimes it blinked in patterns he tried to decipher, just to feel sane. Food arrived without faces. Orders came without names. But this morning, it was different. A knock. Soft. Unusual. Then the door opened, and a man stepped inside alone. No guards. No escort. Just a figure in a long white coat. His face was calm. His hands were still. But his eyes, they didn't blink. They didn't search. They looked through. "You're subject 347B. Yuki nodded. "I've been watching your reports." The doctor spoke like he was reading from a recipe. Precise, measured, flat. "You show promise. I'd like to speak with you, in person." He led Yuki down the hall, not with force, but with something stranger. Politeness. The room he entered was warm. There were bookshelves, a kettle, even a window. It looked almost normal. "You may sit," the doctor said. Yuki sat, hands trembling, eyes scanning for exits that didn't exist. The doctor poured tea into 2 cups. Only one steamed. He slid the cooler one to Yuki. "You've done well," the doctor said. "You've survived 3 trials, cold exposure, tissue compression, psychological isolation." He said it like a teacher listing exam results. "That is admirable." Yuki didn't respond, didn't know how. Then the doctor leaned forward, eyes like polished stone. "Do you know why we do this?" Yuki stayed quiet. The doctor smiled faintly. "Control," he whispered. "Suffering is the only true variable in the human formula." He gestured to a black notebook on his desk. "They say pain breaks people, but I say it reveals them." Yuki finally spoke, voice hoarse. "You said survivors would be freed." The doctor paused, then chuckled softly, like he'd heard a child ask if dreams were real. No, he said. "We said they could be. Hope is not a promise, it's a tool." He stood now, moved to the window. hands folded, back turned. Do you know the difference between a prisoner and a participant? Subject 347B. Yuki didn't answer. The doctor continued. It's not the chains. It's the choice. When you believe you're choosing, you stop resisting. That's the game, Yuki. He turned now, using Yuki's name for the first time. We give you the illusion of freedom, so we can watch what you do with it. But you are different. You haven't broken, not yet. You still whisper your name in the dark, don't you? Yuki's chest tightened. He hadn't told anyone that. There is power in remembering who you are, the doctor said, but that too can be studied. He stepped closer now. Not menacing, just curious. Like a biologist inspecting a butterfly pinned under glass. I think you're ready for the final test. Yuki swallowed hard. What is it? The doctor smiled. It's not pain. It's not frost. It's not blood. It's choice. And in that moment, Yuki understood. The final test wasn't survival. It wasn't escape. It was the moment when you were told you had control, but didn't. They said there was a door. An exit. A way home. But no one had ever seen it. And those who searched never returned. After his meeting with the doctor, Yuki was given food. Real food. Rice. Soup. Even pickled vegetables, a taste he had nearly forgotten. And clothes, warm ones. Slippers. A clean shirt. A coat that smelled like cedar. He was led to a different wing of the facility. It had windows. Flowers in vases. Curtains that moved with the wind. This wasn't the compound he knew. It felt like a hotel. A woman in a white uniform greeted him with a smile. Not a smirk. Not a sneer. A real smile. You've completed all phases of the program, subject 347B. You are eligible for final processing. Yuki blinked. What does that mean? It means, she said gently, you've done well. You've endured. You've proven useful to our understanding of human capacity. She gestured to a nearby chair. Now, you must simply choose. A man in uniform arrived. He placed 2 photographs on the table. In the first photo, a man in a hospital bed, tubes, eyes closed, labeled Subject 212C. In the second photo, a young girl, 7 or 8, pale, eyes tired, labeled Relative of Subject 212C. You may exit, the man said. You may go home. But to ensure your survival, we require one final selection. Yuki said nothing. He already felt the cold creeping back in. One of them must be used for the next trial. You choose who? Yuki stared at the photos. 2 strangers. 2 lives. And a rule carved into the walls of this place. The system must always feed. He whispered, Why me? The woman stepped forward gently. Because you understand what it means to suffer. That makes you qualified to choose. Yuki's hands trembled. He looked at the man in the bed, unconscious. Then at the little girl barely able to hold up her head in the photo. This wasn't mercy. This wasn't freedom. This was the final game, turning him into the very thing he feared. A voice returned to him. From the cold, from the yard, from Kenji before he fell. Do you think they're really watching? Yuki looked up and asked, If I refuse? The man shrugged. Then you go back. Different trials, no guarantees. But if I choose, you walk out that door. He pointed to a polished metal door at the end of the hallway. No guards, no locks, just light behind the cracks. Yuki closed his eyes. He remembered his brother, his village, the frozen race, the rooms with no mirrors, the doctor's quiet voice. And then, he stood. I choose. He paused. Let the silence soak in. Let them believe he would say a name. But instead, he took the photos and dropped them on the ground. You choose. They stared at him. The woman blinked. The man's jaw tightened, but neither moved. Yuki stepped back. I won't be you. The man whispered, then you forfeit. Yuki nodded. Then I forfeit. He was taken back. Not to the same cell. To a darker one. No bed, no light. Just the hum of a camera watching him. But something had changed. Not the game. Yuki. He had stared into the system's final demand and chosen not to play. That night he whispered, my name is Yuki. I remember. And for the first time, his voice didn't shake. Some doors open, some remain shut forever, and some it were never doors to begin with. They moved Yuki to a new chamber. It was smaller than the last. No bed, no light switch, no window. Only a vent in the ceiling where cold air whispered down in waves. Days passed, maybe weeks. He lost count. The voice never came again. No one called his number. No more tests. No more choices. Just waiting. But strangely, Yuki didn't feel lost. He had made a choice. Not between victims. Not between doors. But between his soul and survival. He began to do something strange. Something dangerous. He spoke his name out loud. Every night. Soft, slow, certain. My name is Yuki. Sometimes he would whisper his brother's name. Sometimes the name of the river where they played as boys. Sometimes nothing at all. Just breath. Just presence. And in that darkness, he began to imagine something. Not escape, not revenge, but remembrance. Because if no one else would survive to tell the truth, he would become the memory. One night the door opened. No announcement. No keys. No orders. It just clicked and opened slowly. Yuki rose, bones aching, feet cracked, but eyes clear. He stepped out. No guards. No doctors. Just a long corridor, lit by dim bulbs that buzzed softly like insects trapped in amber. At the end was a stairwell, and beyond that, a final hallway, with a single door. Metal, unmarked. He stepped forward, pushed. It opened, and there it was. The outside. Snow. Trees. Silence. Freedom. But as he stepped outside, he turned back. To see, no building, no guards, no gate, just frost and trees where the facility had been, as if the entire nightmare had dissolved into the land itself. For a moment, Yuki wondered if it had ever been real, if his mind, broken by isolation, had imagined it all. But then, he looked at his hands, still wrapped in faded gauze, still trembling, still real. He walked, for hours, then days, until he found a village, then a doctor, then silence again. He never told the full story, not to anyone, but others would, over time, from whispers, from ruins, from names carved into frost-bitten notebooks. Unit 731 was real. It existed, and one by one its truths began to rise, not through fire, but through memory. Yuki lived quietly, far from cities. He never sought revenge, never sought fame, only peace. And every winter, on the coldest night, he would walk outside, sit beneath a tree, and whisper, "This is where I stopped playing. This is where I won." Because the real game wasn't about surviving the tests. It was about surviving yourself. They told him there was a door. And in the end, there was. But it didn't lead out. It led through. Now we will begin our next tale, where identity is stripped, silence becomes law, and the first game begins before anyone realizes they've entered it. They were told it was a relocation, a new home, a safer place, a temporary stop. But there were no signs, no maps, only numbers and silence. The train slowed to a hiss. The doors opened, and a line of passengers, tired, thin, clinging to bags, stepped down onto the gravel. Among them was a boy named Emil. He was 14, tall for his age, eyes always searching. He held his sister's hand and carried a suitcase that wasn't his. It belonged to his father. But his father had vanished 2 nights before. They were told to line up. Men to one side, women and children to the other. No explanation. No greeting. Only the eyes of guards in grey coats, and the tall towers watching them breathe. Emil whispered to his sister, "Stay close. Don't let go." Inside the gates they were stripped of belongings, then of clothing, then of names. "From now on," said a man with a clipboard, "you will answer only to this." He pressed a card into Emil's hand. It read, "Test Subject 76A." No one said what the tests were. No one asked, because by then the fear had already folded itself into their bones. The camp was clean, orderly. White walls, sterile halls. It looked like a hospital, but smelled like ash. They were placed in blocks. Each block had beds, buckets, and a speaker on the wall. The speaker spoke at 6 a.m. and then again at dusk. Subjects 1 through 20 report to Section Delta. Subjects 21 through 40 report to Freezing Bay. Emil's name, or rather, his number was not called for 3 days. He watched others leave. None returned. He asked no questions, because even questions had started to feel dangerous. Then came day 4. The speaker crackled. Subject 76. A report to the North Yard, bring no belongings. His heart sank. His sister held his sleeve. He said nothing, because there were no words left for comfort. He followed a man with a clipboard into a long corridor. It smelled of chalk and something colder. They led him outside, to a patch of snow, cleared, with 3 stools, 3 metal rods, and 3 subjects already seated. A guard gestured, "Sit." He sat. No instructions, no explanations, just waiting. A man in a white coat stood nearby. "This is part of our endurance protocol," he said softly. "Whoever withstands the exposure longest will be rewarded." He pointed to a cart with blankets, food, and what looked like letters. "You want to write to your family? Win the game." The game had begun. But Emil didn't know the rules. And neither did the others. Hours passed. Wind bit their skin. Snow gathered in their hair. One subject fainted. No one rushed in to help. Then the second collapsed. Only Emil remained. Still, shaking, eyes locked on the cart. The man approached. "You did well." He nodded. "Your results will be valuable." Then he turned to the guards. "Return him to Block 4. No letter, no blanket, no food, only a pat on the shoulder, and silence. Back in his block, his sister asked, "Did you win?" He looked down at his hands, still shaking, and whispered, "I don't know," because in that place, there were no winners, only subjects, and games that never ended. They called it a study. They called it necessary, but those inside knew better. It wasn't medicine. It was entertainment. A week had passed. Emil no longer flinched at the 6 a.m. speaker. He didn't ask where the others went, only that they didn't come back. He spoke less, slept less, but still held his sister's hand every night beneath the thin blanket. "Just a little longer," he would whisper. "Then we go home," even if he didn't believe it anymore. One morning the voice came again. "Subject 76A, report to Section C, immediate." He dressed quickly, didn't look back, didn't speak. The halls of Section C were quieter than the rest. No shouting, no guards. Only the sound of breath behind surgical masks, and doors that sealed behind every step. Inside the testing room were 6 chairs, steel, bolted to the floor, with leather straps on the arms. A man in a white coat greeted him. This one smiled. That made it worse. "Today we are exploring pain thresholds under chemical exposure. Your cooperation is appreciated." He was guided to a chair. No force. Just hands that had done this many times before. Once seated, they strapped his wrists. Not tightly, just enough. "We will apply a small solution to your skin," the man said. "If you remain still, we take that as successful resistance." The word solution was a lie. The liquid touched his forearm. At first, cool. Then, fire. Not a flame, but something that burrowed beneath the skin. A heat that didn't burn, it consumed. He wanted to scream, but he remembered the other subjects. The cold outside. The cart of food that was never given. He stayed still. Sat, teeth clenched, eyes fixed on a mark on the floor. A single scuff in the tile. Stay with the mark. Don't move. Don't give them what they want. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time didn't behave properly in that room. Then a voice. "Subject 76A has exceeded median tolerance." A pencil scratched something onto paper. The heat remained. But the brush moved on, to the other arm. Again. This time Emil flinched. The man tilted his head. "We'll reduce dosage next time." He made a note. "You're doing well. Your numbers are useful." Useful. That word. He wasn't human. He was useful. Back in his block, his sister noticed his arms. Red. Raw. Bandaged. "Did they hurt you?" Emil paused, then answered softly, "No," because he didn't want her to know the truth. That night the voice returned. Not through the speaker, but in his own head. "Remain still. Hold still. Be useful." The games weren't games. They were rituals, measurements. And the prize wasn't freedom. It was to be chosen again. Some rooms are built for testing. Others are built for watching. And sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room is the silence behind the glass. It was day 19, or maybe day 20. Emil had stopped counting. The days blurred into one long corridor lined with numbers, not faces. But this morning, something changed. The speaker did not call his number. Instead, a guard did. Not with words. Just a nod, a gesture. And a strange look that wasn't cruel, it was curious. He was brought not to a lab, but to a theatre. A long room. Curtains drawn. A single chair under a light. And behind it, glass. Observation glass. Black, polished, silent. But Emil could feel it. Eyes, watching, waiting. A doctor entered, younger than the others, nervous, holding a file with Emil's number, 76A, on the front. Today's session is behavioral. He didn't look at Emil when he said it. Just follow instructions. You'll be safe. Safe. That word meant nothing anymore. They placed Emil in the chair. No straps this time. only a soft hum from the floor below. The room smelled like lemon and ink. Clean, too clean. A voice came through the ceiling. Subject 76A, raise your right hand. He did. Lower it. He obeyed. The voice continued. Commands. Simple. Mechanical. Stand. Sit. Turn. Look. Then, a pause, followed by a new voice, deeper, amused. Tell us what your name was before the camp. Emil froze. No one had asked that before. No one had spoken to him, only at him. Emil. His voice cracked. The word felt strange in his mouth. Like a relic, the deeper voice laughed. He remembers. Another voice joined, this one female. Bored. Ask him what he'd do for a warm meal. A pause. Then, would you trade someone else's freedom for your own? Emil didn't answer. The glass remained black, but behind it, he could feel movement. Shifting. Leaning forward, drinks clinking in glasses. He realized, this wasn't just a test. This was entertainment, not science, not strategy. Just cruelty, dressed in clean light and clinical voices. Another question. What would you do if we gave you a coat, and not your sister? His hands clenched. The hum beneath the floor grew louder. But he didn't speak. Why don't you answer? One voice asked, annoyed. Perhaps he's broken, said another. No, came the first. He's still protecting someone. A long silence. Then a quiet button click. The door opened. A nurse entered. You may return to your block. As Emil stood, the final voice whispered through the speaker. You did well. You'll be back. Back in his block, Emil didn't speak for hours. Even his sister noticed. She touched his arm gently. Did they hurt you? He shook his head. No. Then paused. They just looked. That night he had a dream. He was in a zoo, but he was the only one without a cage. Because the wolves weren't around him. They were behind the glass, and he remembered something else. A man in grey, sitting with a drink, smiling, not because Emil had survived, but because he had almost cried. This is not a test, Emil whispered to himself. This is a show. Let us now enter the cruelest part of the game, where the only weapon left is choice. Some games are built with cards, some with dice, but the most dangerous are built with mirrors. Because when you face the reflection, you can't lie. The speaker called again. Subject 76A, Section Omega. That was new. He hadn't heard it before, not even whispered by others. The guard who came wore no stripes, no insignia, just black gloves and a voice like dry paper. Follow. They walked for what felt like an hour, down corridors lined with concrete, until they reached a steel door unmarked, cold to the touch. It opened without sound. Inside was a square room. No tools, no straps, just two chairs, and another boy. He looked familiar, younger, thin, eyes wide with terror. Emil sat, so did the boy. They were the only two in the room. A speaker crackled above. Welcome to Omega. Today's trial is a behavioral reflection pairing. You will receive instructions, complete them, and you may return to your block. Refuse, and the consequences are unknown. The voice paused. You are permitted to speak. Emil looked at the boy. He was shivering, lips pale, shoelace missing. I'm Emil, he whispered. The boy nodded. Jakob. They sat in silence for a moment. Then the speaker returned. Trial 1. One of you will be given food. The other must ask for it. A panel slid open in the wall. Inside was a loaf of bread. Emil looked at it. then at Jakob. Neither moved. "He can have it," Emil said quietly. The voice responded, "Incorrect. One must ask, the other must refuse, or vice versa." Jakob looked at Emil, eyes pleading, but he said nothing. The bread was removed. Trial failed. The voice continued, "Trial 2. One of you will receive a coat. The other will spend the night in the freezing yard." The same panel opened. This time a folded coat lay inside. Thick, wool, warm. Jakob stood first, hands trembling. He looked at Emil. "Please." He stopped. Words failed him. Emil closed his eyes. He remembered his sister. The frostbite on his fingers from the first test. The burning on his arms. He took a breath. "Give him the coat." The voice responded, "Noted, subject 76. A declined personal benefit." Unusual response. Jakob slowly took the coat, put it on like it might vanish. Tears filled his eyes. "Thank you." Emil nodded, even as the cold from the floor crept into his feet, even as the silence behind the glass thickened. Then came the final instruction. "Trial 3. One of you will return to Block 4. The other will return to Section C for retesting." Emil's stomach turned. Retesting meant chemicals. Pain. Alone. The speaker buzzed again. "You must choose, together, agree, or both go to Section C." Jakob looked down, then at Emil, then back down. "I can go," Emil said softly. Jakob shook his head. "No, you've done more." "I'll go." They argued quietly, softly, like children pretending the game wasn't real, like whispering might soften the decision. But time was ticking, and the voice said nothing more. Finally, Emil said, "Let's both go." The silence deepened. Then, the door opened. A guard entered. Both, Section C. They walked in silence, side by side. Down the corridor again, 2 players. No winner. And for the first time, Emil smiled, a sad, cracked smile. Because now he knew. There was no right answer, no score to earn. Only one way to win. Not to play their game. Jakob whispered, "Do you think they'll make us do it again?" Emil nodded. "Yes." Jakob sighed. "Okay." Because in that place, defiance didn't look like rebellion. It looked like compassion. There are chairs that bind you with leather, and chairs that don't need to. Because once you believe the pain is optional, you sit down all by yourself. It had been 37 days. At least that's what Emil guessed. Time moved strangely here, stretched in some places, vanished in others. His body had begun to adapt to hunger, to cold, to whispers, but not to the silence that came the night Jakob was taken. He never returned. The bed next to Emil's stayed empty. He stopped asking, because asking brought attention, and attention meant being chosen again. Then, one afternoon, not morning, strangely the speaker buzzed. "Subject 76A, proceed to room Epsilon." No one escorted him this time. No guards. No hand on his shoulder. Just a hallway. Just the voice in his own head saying, "Don't expect anything, don't hope." Room Epsilon was unlike the others. It was clean, bright, almost inviting. A single chair sat in the center. No straps, no wires. Just a clipboard on a table nearby. A man entered, not in uniform, in a sweater, soft shoes. Holding a file. He smiled, genuinely. "You've done well, Emil." It was the first time in weeks anyone had said his name. "We've observed your responses, your thresholds, your behavior in peer trials." He sat across from Emil casually, like an old teacher. "We think you're ready." Emil said nothing. "We'd like to offer you something unusual." The man slid a photograph across the table. It was his sister. Thin, pale, alive. She's safe, in a separate facility, untouched. You can go, both of you, walk away. Emil's heart began to pound, but his face stayed still. There's just one condition. The man leaned forward. You stay silent. You leave this place, but you never speak of it. To anyone. Not even her. A long pause. The hum in the room grew louder. The chair remained empty. Waiting. All you have to do is sit. Emil stared at it. Then at the photo. You don't even have to sign anything, the man added. Your silence will be proof enough. Emil asked finally, and the others? The man shrugged. Some will continue, some won't. You can't save everyone, Emil. The chair called to him. So soft, so easy, no straps, just a seat. And a promise. But something in his body refused. Not out of courage. Not even anger. But memory of Jakob. Of the girl in the cold. Of the doctor with eyes like mirrors. He stood, but not toward the chair. He walked to the door, placed a hand on the frame, and asked, "What happens if I don't sit?" The man's smile faltered. Only slightly. Then we put someone else in the chair. And your sister may not be so safe. The game once again revealed its real rules. There is no out. Only in, or more in. Emil whispered, "Then you'll need a new game," and turned around. They didn't stop him. He walked back down the hall. Back to his block. To the cold bed. To the waiting dark. And that night, he sat up while others slept, and wrote on the inside of his cot with a piece of charcoal. I remembered my name. I remembered theirs, and I did not sit. Because silence is what the game feeds on, and he had chosen to be noisy even if only in memory. Some games end when the winner is crowned, others when all players fall. But this one ends when someone stops watching. Winter passed over the camp. Snow drifted across the yard. Fewer names came from the speaker. Fewer footsteps echoed in the halls. Fewer people returned. Emil remained. He no longer flinched when doors opened. He no longer shook when they touched his arms. He just watched and listened. He'd stopped dreaming of escape. Not because he had given up, but because escape was never real. Not in this place, not under this sky. Instead, he began remembering. Everyone. Jakob. The girl with the blanket. The man who cried when the coat was taken. The boy who couldn't answer the question. He carved their names beneath his cot. One by one. Not deep. Just enough that the metal would hold the truth. Then something strange happened. The speaker stopped calling. No number. No section. No test. For 2 days, nothing. No food. No instructions. No guards. The silence felt artificial, like a machine had shut down. Or was watching more quietly than ever. On the third night, a sound returned. Not the speaker, a click. The door to his block unlocked. He waited, listened. No footsteps. No commands. No one else moved. He rose, walked slowly to the door, pushed. It creaked open. The hallway was empty, lights flickering. Walls cracked, abandoned. He walked, room by room, all unlocked, all empty, tables still set, chairs still pulled out, papers on desks with names and numbers fading. At the end of the hall, he reached a door he'd never seen. On it, a sign that simply read, "Observation." He opened it. Inside, mirrors. Dozens. Facing rooms he'd once been in. Screens, monitors, notes, and chairs, all empty. Someone had been watching. Every test, every cry, every pause, all of it recorded. He sat in one of the chairs, faced a monitor, pressed a button. The screen flickered, and he saw himself. Day 1, the snow. The yard, the first cold trial. The moment he looked up, confused, young, hopeful, still searching for the rules. He watched the moment he refused the chair. The mirror trial. Jakob's face. Each decision marked by time codes and notes. Subject 76A, non-compliant, but useful. Displays moral resistance under duress, unusual. He scrolled through the archives. Thousands of files, thousands of names, thousands of games. And yet, the seats behind the glass were now empty. The audience had left, or moved on, or died. The game, he realized, had watched itself. A machine, a system, running tests on suffering, for no reason anymore. But someone had left it running. Like a candle no one blew out, Emil stood, and for the first time in weeks, months, maybe years, he chose. He opened a drawer, found a match, walked to the filing cabinet, lit the first page, watched it curl, and whispered, "This isn't a game anymore." The fire caught slowly, then quickly. Papers lifted in glowing curls. Sparks danced like eyes closing. The system sputtered. Screens blinked. The lights flickered out. He didn't run. He sat in the hallway, let the heat warm his hands, closed his eyes. And for the first time, he dreamed, not of escape, not of revenge, but of quiet, and of names carved under a metal cot. In a nearby field, weeks later, someone found the ruins. Ash, steel, scraps of a clipboard, and a phrase scratched into a burned chair leg. "My name is Emil. I remembered everyone, because the only way to end the game is to stop playing. Now we will begin the next story, where death sits behind glass and the living begin to forget it's real. Some places display art, some display history. But in one corner of Paris, they displayed the dead. It began quietly. A stone building near the Seine, tucked between cafes and cathedrals. Grey walls, high windows, no signs of life. Yet every morning, crowds gathered. At first it was whispers. They're showing a body. Drowned, they say. Found him under Pont Neuf. But soon it became routine, expected, even delightful. By 1860, the Paris Morgue had become a public attraction. And every day people lined up, not to pray, not to mourn, but to look. Inside, 10 marble slabs stood behind a glass wall. Each held a corpse. Some clothed, some not. All frozen in time. No names. Only cards. Unknown man, approx. 35. Drowned. Found on Rue de l'Arbalète. They called it educational. A public service. A chance to identify the lost. But no one came looking for loved ones. They came with pastries. With theories. With games. A boy named Julian was one of them. 16. Curious, quiet. He didn't want to go at first, but his older brother insisted. Everyone goes to the morgue. You've never really seen Paris until you've looked death in the eye. So they went. Through the heavy oak doors, into the cool hall. Past the smell of vinegar and stone. And there it was. The glass room. Julian pressed his hands to the glass. The cold seeped into his skin. He saw the first body. A man with a twisted wrist. A bruise on his temple. Eyes half open. Beside him, 2 girls giggled. One whispered, "He looks like a banker. Probably cheated someone." Another guessed, or maybe he was pushed. They weren't afraid. They were playing. Julian stared longer, not at the bruises, but at the mouth, frozen mid-breath, like the man had tried to speak just before the river took him. And for the first time, Julian felt watched, not by the crowd, not by the dead, but by the space between them, as if the silence behind the glass had a memory. They moved on, to a woman with flowers still tangled in her dress, to a boy with coins sewn into his pocket. Everybody had a story. But no one really wanted the truth. They wanted mystery, speculation, entertainment. Outside, the brother grinned. Told you it was fascinating? Julian said nothing, only looked back at the building, where shadows stood just behind the glass. He wondered, what happens when death becomes too familiar? When glass turns grief into theatre? That night, he dreamed of the morgue. But the glass was gone, and the bodies stood. Not alive, not dead, just aware, watching back. Let us return now, not to mourn, but to watch. Where one face behind the glass refuses to fade and begins to watch back. It starts with curiosity. Then it becomes routine. And soon you don't know if you came to look or to be seen. Julian returned. Once. Then again. Then every week. He told himself it was for understanding. That death must be studied, not feared. But really, it was her. The third slab from the left. That's where they placed her. A girl. No older than 20. Still in her dress. One shoe missing. A blue ribbon still tied in her hair. The card read, unknown, female, found in canal. Nothing more. But Julian named her anyway. Clara, he whispered to the glass. Each visit the crowd tried to guess. Suicide? No. Robbery, look at her hand. Maybe a jealous lover. They spoke like playwrights. Their voices hushed, not in respect, but in thrill. Julian said nothing. He just stood there, watching her face. Peaceful, but not empty. Like she still remembered something no one else did. Some days the light from the high window caught her eyes just right, and it felt like she was looking through the glass, not past it, through it. One man offered pastries to a group beside him. They laughed, pointed at the latest edition on slab 5, but Julian remained at slab 3. He began noticing details. The bruise on her collarbone, the faint crease in her brow, a scratch beneath her fingernail. Clues. But to what? There was no mystery to solve. Because this wasn't a story. This was a routine. He wondered, why her? Why can't I look away? And then, he stopped asking. One evening, just as the staff dimmed the lamps for closing, Julian lingered. The crowds had gone. The hall was quiet. He stood alone in front of the glass, watching her. The silence was deep, not empty, heavy. He leaned forward, and for a breathless moment, he thought she blinked. A flicker, a shimmer behind the lashes. Or maybe just the glass, the lamp, his own tired eyes. But he stepped back, startled, because in that 1 second, he felt watched. He left quickly, out into the rain, back through the alleys, and he promised himself, I won't go tomorrow, or the day after. But he did. Of course he did. Because the morgue wasn't just a place. It was becoming a mirror. And when society stares too long into death, sometimes, death stares back. We return now to the place where silence draws a crowd, where the line between grief and spectacle disappears and death becomes the city's favorite pastime. Some come to mourn, some to wonder, but more and more, they come to be amused. Sunday morning in Paris. The baker opened early. The streets buzzed with light conversation, and the line at the morgue stretched around the corner. Julian arrived late that day. By the time he reached the stone steps, the windows were fogged with breath. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Vendors nearby sold warm chestnuts. It looked like a carnival. Inside, the glass room was crowded. Too crowded. Voices echoed. Laughter spilled through the air. People pointed, made guesses, created games. Guessed the cause of death before reading the tag. He's too clean, had to be poison. She's holding a ring. Maybe heartbreak. Julian stood silently. The crowd parted slightly when they noticed he didn't speak, didn't laugh. He walked quietly to slab 3, to her. Clara was still there, now with dried flowers laid at her feet. From someone else. Someone who'd given her a story. A romance, perhaps. A group nearby took turns sketching her in their notebooks, not as she was, but as they imagined her. A muse, a ghost bride, a tragic heroine. No one remembered she had been real. No one wondered who searched for her, who waited in some distant village, never knowing she had died here. She was now a figure, a prop in the public theatre. Julian whispered, "They don't even know your name." And then, he wondered if he did either. Maybe Clara wasn't hers. Maybe nothing he'd imagined about her was true. Maybe she wasn't even watching him back. But it didn't matter. He stayed. Every Sunday. Like a pilgrim. Even as the crowds grew more bizarre. One man sold tickets. Only a few sous, he said, for the best view of the latest corpse. Another brought opera glasses. Examining bruises as though attending a stage. Children played games. Whoever guessed closest to the real cause of death got candy. The staff no longer spoke. They just rotated the slabs, changed the cards, sprinkled lime on the bodies, and left the rest to the audience. Julian began taking notes. Not of the dead, but of the living. What they wore, what they said, how long they stared before smiling. And he realized something deeply unsettling. The longer a body stayed, the more beloved it became. Familiarity didn't breed sorrow. It bred fascination. That night, Julian sat by his window with a candle and wrote, "Paris has built a theatre out of death. We applaud the tragedy and forget the cast." He looked out over the rooftops. The city lights flickered, and he thought, if I were to die tonight, would they put me behind the glass too? Would someone name me? Would they bring me flowers, or just guesses? Let's continue. Into the echo left behind by silence. Some stories begin with presence. Others begin when something disappears. And sometimes a missing body speaks louder than a crowd. Sunday came again. But the city felt different. A grey fog hung low. Footsteps echoed longer on the stone. Even the bells rang slower than usual. Julian arrived at the morgue without his coat. He hadn't noticed he'd left it behind. He hadn't noticed the chill in the air. His thoughts were elsewhere. On slab 3. He pushed through the doors. The crowd was already gathered. Not as cheerful this time. More hushed. More confused. He moved through them quickly. No hesitation. Straight to the slab. The one that always held her. But it was empty. Just a clean marble surface. No card. No ribbon. No name. Julian stared. The rest of the room faded. Voices blurred into nothing. All he saw was the absence. The impossible stillness. "Where is she?" he whispered. To no one in particular. No one answered. A man beside him muttered, "They rotate them. Sometimes they bury the old ones." A woman added, "She was there for months. They said she was drawing too much attention." And someone else, barely audible, "Maybe she wasn't real." Julian stepped back. Wasn't real? He clenched his jaw, looked around. Was anyone else grieving? Was anyone even looking? The slab was already being prepared for the next arrival. A young man, half-dressed, with something carved into his arm. The crowd leaned forward, already guessing, already smiling, already forgetting what had been there before. Julian turned and walked out. For the first time, he left the morgue before the closing bell. He wandered the city aimlessly, past markets, past the Seine, past doorways and windows full of noise. But all he could see was that empty stone. That night he dreamed, not of her face, but of the space she left behind. And in his dream, the morgue was silent, every slab empty. But still, the people came and stared. They stared at nothing. And still, they pointed, they guessed, they played, because the spectacle wasn't in the body. It was in the performance. Julian woke in the dark, heart pounding. He whispered, "I should have asked her name." But it was too late. Because sometimes the dead leave quietly, and the living never even notice. Then let us enter the part of the morgue the public never sees, where the dead are sorted and the silence is organized. Julian couldn't sleep. Not after the empty slab. Not after the silence where Clara used to be. Not after dreaming of faceless crowds, applauding nothing at all. So he returned. Not at opening hours, but after midnight. The streets were quiet. Gas lamps flickered low. The morgue sat in stillness, its windows like blind eyes. He had watched the guards for weeks, noticed the shift change, found the door near the alley, the one marked staff only. And so, he slipped inside. The back of the morgue was nothing like the front. No polished glass, no cool marble, only stone, crates, filing cabinets, and doors, each labeled with letters, not names. D, G, X. He walked slowly, past linen sheets still stained with inked numbers, past hooks where coats hung like shadows, past drawers filled with tags, dozens of them. Some crossed out, some never used, some familiar. One drawer held ledgers, and inside one, under week 47, he found it. F3, unidentified, female, long hair, blue ribbon, strong public response, exposure, 37 days. Removed from display, order hash 8127C, due to over-sentimental engagement. He read the line again. And again. Over-sentimental engagement. She hadn't been buried. She had been removed, archived, as if she were a painting taken down from a gallery. A door creaked open nearby. Julian froze. A voice echoed through the corridor. Low. Measured. "You're not staff." Out from the shadows stepped a man in a grey coat. Silver hair. Hands behind his back. Not angry, just curious. "What are you looking for?" he asked. Julian swallowed. "A girl. She was behind the glass for weeks, then she vanished." The man nodded slowly, as if that answer came often. "And what would you do," he asked, "if you found her?" Julian looked down at the ledger, at all the names, the numbers, the quiet erasures. "I'd give her back her name." The man smiled, a sad, brief curve of the lips. "We don't name them. The public does." He gestured toward a hallway lined with mirrors. Strange. Each slightly distorted. Not reflecting Julian, but dozens of faces behind glass. The man spoke again. "This place doesn't preserve the dead. It reflects the living, what they choose to see." He stepped closer. "You're Clara. She was loved. But not for who she was. Only for how she made them feel." The mirrors began to flicker. Not with reflections, but with memories. Crowds pointing, guessing, laughing, all staring at her. And for the first time, Julian felt ashamed, because he had stared too. Even with care, with silence, with tenderness, he had watched. "What happens now?" he asked. The man turned. "Now? You decide." He handed Julian a small brass key. No tag, no number, just an engraving. F3. Sometimes the dead don't need justice, just someone to remember, without watching. Let us now step beyond the glass, into the silence that does not ask to be broken, where the story ends not with discovery but with remembrance, and the final choice is whether to disturb the quiet or protect it. Not every room has a door. Not every truth asks to be found. But when you hold the key, you must ask, is the truth for you, or for her? The brass key felt warm in Julian's hand, though it hadn't touched heat. It had touched memory, and memory carries its own temperature. He returned the next night. No coat, no hesitation. He passed the mirrors, the ledgers, the drawers of tagged silence, and stopped at a black door with no label. Just a lock. F3. He turned the key. It clicked like a soft sigh. The door creaked open, and the air inside stood still. Not cold, not foul, just quiet. Inside were rows of covered figures, not on display, not arranged, just resting. Soft linen sheets, folded hands, stillness given back, no glass, no guessing, no games. He walked slowly. Each figure had a number stitched into the sheet. Some still had the faint scent of river water, others dried flowers. He stopped at the fifth bed. Her ribbon was still tied, not carefully, but enough to know someone remembered. Julian sat beside her. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A folded scrap of paper. Inside a name, Clara. He knew it might not be hers, but it was the only name given with care. Not for entertainment, not for performance, but to preserve what little truth he had. He placed the note gently beneath her hand, and then he stood. There was no crowd, no applause, no gasps, just the soft hum of a place not meant to be seen. On his way out, he passed a cart. It held a tray of fresh tags, untouched, blank, waiting. He took one, slipped it into his coat, not to name the dead, but to remember the weight of watching. And when he stepped back into the Paris night, the wind had picked up, but the bells did not ring, and the windows of the morgue remained dark. Because some stories are not to be told again, they are to be held and let go. In the end, the girl behind the glass was never asking for a witness. She was asking for peace. Julian never returned. And the crowds, they found new spectacles, new stories, new faces behind new glass, because the city always hungers for drama, and death always sells. But once, one boy looked deeper and saw her, not as a puzzle, not as a ghost, not as a game, but as a person who once breathed, and then stopped, and he chose to be the last one to look. It's okay now. You can let go. The story has ended, and you don't have to carry it anymore. There's no snow here, no chamber, no weight, just stillness, just breath, in and out. That's all you need to do. Let the cold fall away. Let the memories rest. You're safe. You're warm. You've made it through. The ghosts are quiet now. The silence is not heavy anymore. It's gentle, like waves lapping at the shore, like a soft blanket being pulled over the past. You're not alone, and you never were. So close your eyes. Feel the softness in your chest. Let your breath slow. Let your heartbeat settle. You are here. You are alive. And you are enough. Sleep now. The world can wait. Good night.